Welcome to Disunion, the Government Union Report, the podcast where we delve into the ever-evolving landscape of public sector labor policy and law. I'm your host, David R. Osborne, and I'm excited to be your guide through the complex world of government unionization. We bring in experts and individuals with hands-on experience navigating the challenges and opportunities surrounding the unionization of government employees. From the latest legal developments to the practical insights that shape the policies, we've got it covered. So get ready to gain a deeper understanding of the newsmaking issues that impact public sector labor policy across the nation. Liya Palagashvili is a senior research fellow and director of the Labor Policy Project at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Her research focuses on labor regulations, the gig economy, and the changing nature of work. You should check out her Substack. It's called Labor Market Matters. Hey, Liya, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. I reached out to Liya after seeing an article she posted on Substack. It's called On the Future of Conservative Labor Policy. Thought it was really good. It was quoting largely from an article, an op-ed that she wrote for Fortune magazine. But at the time, as it turns out, she was in the middle of some research that really sounded fascinating. It'll be released shortly. Around when, Liya?
Probably in the next week or so, but I'm going to have a Substack post that'll be out this week that summarizes the research study even before the paper is out. So it'll summarize all of our findings and results.
Okay, fantastic. Well, it addresses the question, do more powerful unions generate better pro-worker outcomes? It is a literature review that looks at 147 studies from the top 5 economics journals. So, Liya, I'm going to ask you to answer that question a little later. First, I wanted to address 2 preliminary questions I had. First, how do you measure whether a union is powerful? And then second, what do you mean by pro-worker outcomes?
Yeah, I'm going to start with the second question first. So pro-worker outcomes, so people generally think of pro-worker outcomes, do they have high wages, right? Or do they have, good working conditions? And that's the thing we're most accustomed to thinking about. Or do they, do they have job security? It's like a European style, like pro-worker outcome. Like, can you not get fired from your job? It's very important for Europeans not to be fired from your job. By the way, my husband is Italian from Milan. And so I've lived in Europe too. And this is the mentality of like what people think about pro-worker outcomes is you can't get fired from your job and you get like structured raises and wages every year. As part of that conversation, though, it's important to point out pro-worker outcomes are also about job opportunities, being able to get a job, being able to have employment opportunities, having low levels of unemployment in the country is also a pro-worker outcome. And for this study, we included these various measures of pro-worker outcomes on employment, including wages, employment and wages, basically. Those are the 2 things. Employment, what I mean by that is like, do you have a job? What is the work opportunities like in the country? Are there high levels of unemployment and so forth? And wages are, what's happening with real wage growth over several years or across different sectors. Now, on the first question, there's many different ways that economists kind of measure it. One is like union density, presence of unions. You look at kind of the negotiations presented as well. That's another one. It was an interesting variable of how like the strength of a union is as you look at kind of the negotiations of unions at those levels. A recent study also used the basically like work strikes and work stoppages, because if there's a lot of them and high frequency of them, that's a proxy for a stronger union kind of bargaining weight, if that makes sense. They can leverage more if there's a lot of high frequency of work stoppages and strikes. So a bunch of different ways of kind of measuring union power, along with like union density and so forth. So it's not just a question of like the presence of unions or no unions, right? So we wanted to capture like this spectrum effect of how strong the union is. And by the way, in other studies, I'll mention one more, they also look at the laws around unions to see as a proxy of like strength of union power. And, do these laws give a lot of power to unions versus are they more balanced in how they give power to unions?
Got it. So how about the role of large bargaining units?
Mm-hmm.
are those also a way to measure whether a union is powerful? How many workers it represents in a single unit?
I think, yeah, so that's also been used as one of the measures. So we look at 147 studies. So all of them use kind of different measures, right? Whatever they can find. Some of it is economists like data, right? Like you just can't get data in Germany on this thing, but you can get it somewhere else, or you can get something else. And so I've seen that used as kind of the independent variable of like unions as well, strength of unions. But yeah, we have in our paper a table, and you'll see like everything that's listed as all the different ways that we can measure union power or union presence or strength of unions. And so you get economists coming up with a bunch of creative things, like how can we measure the power of unions? And the one of the interesting ones is like actually looking at the like bargaining agreements that they're able to get and so forth.
Right.
How high
I could see that.
Or above equilibrium wages in those bargaining agreements and stuff. So yeah, just varies depending on the study. Part of it is just a data problem.
Got it. So these terms are doing a lot of work here in this title. So to the best of your ability, can you answer the question at this point? Do more powerful unions generate better pro-worker outcomes?
Yes, I can answer the question. So it goes back to what do we mean by pro-worker outcomes. So basically our study finds that there's a clear trade-off in how powerful unions affect the well-being of workers and the broader economy. And if we set aside certain contexts and complexities and kind of the certain institutional environments, which I'll get to later, the studies generally indicate that more powerful unions that are using these more aggressive negotiation tactics tend to secure higher wages for unionized workers in the short run. But these wage gains often come at the expense of slower employment growth and fewer jobs for these unionized workers in the long run. And so it's not the case, to answer the question, it's not the case that more powerful labor unions lead to better pro-worker outcomes on all margins. We can say that about a specific, context here where these labor unions in this period in time were able to get higher wages for those unionized workers. But if they were using a lot of aggressive tactics, if they were very powerful unions, like those that in the Rust Belt, after the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, those high wages didn't last for that long, right? It was like a span of 30 years. And then the unions started to dissipate in that region because over time they started to relocate outside of the Rust Belt, started to relocate from the Rust Belt to outside of the Rust Belt in manufacturing. And, we can get to this later, but that was one of the main reasons that we saw a downfall of Rust Belt manufacturing even before kind of the China shock and trade with China started to happen.
So we've got a trade-off here that, at least in the short run, workers might see some real benefits, tangible types of benefits for themselves. But in the long run, a powerful union may be too powerful for its own good, in the sense that maybe the firms that they're negotiating with would find it easier and more efficient to outsource either to another state or maybe even another country.
Yeah, even another country, exactly.
Fair?
Yeah, that's fair. Even to another country, and even to like non-unionized labor. There was a study on manufacturing in California that looked at this as well. But I want to summarize. There's a really great research study that kind of summarized it very well. It said essentially like more moderate and balanced unions are better able to lead to get better gains for workers and to lead to the survival of both the union and the firm in the long run. So you don't want to be like super aggressive and push the company out, which leads to fewer job opportunities for those unionized workers, right? Or maybe the company completely shuts down or relocates. But if you have kind of balanced asks over time, this moderation allows for the survival of both the union and the firm in the long run. Yeah, it was a great study. Yeah, and I think people overlook this because they're like, oh, more powerful unions are needed, but they're not thinking about the longer run effects of like, well, what does that mean in the long run?
Yeah, well, I mean, so what I hear about a lot is something referred to in your papers, the union wage premium. Mm-hmm. So that that over a long period of time, they've observed that union represented jobs have higher wages than non-union represented jobs. And that's usually a reason that people cite for bringing in a union. But tell me more about the union wage premium, aside from just, I guess before asking you this question, I think I got what you were saying before. Maybe for a time, for a worker, the union wage premium exists. However, over time, the trade-off would be, even if the union wage premium continues, the trade-off would be that they might lose their job entirely, right?
Yes. And I actually it's okay. I will highlight the best example that we found in the literature is what happened in the Rust Belt. It showcases this point right here, the long run versus short run, and the pros and the cons of unions. So essentially what happened in the Rust Belt is that they found that labor unions have accounted for labor union conflicts. So they looked at the measures of like work stoppages and major strikes and the wage premium, right, between the unionized workers and the manufacturing Rust Belt compared to non-unionized manufacturing in the Rust Belt, as well as, okay, so the unionized workers in the Rust Belt were making far higher wages than unionized manufacturing workers even outside of the Rust Belt. So they had like a very high wage premium. And so they found that these labor market conflicts in manufacturing in the Rust Belt accounted for 55% of the decline in the Rust Belt's share of U.S. manufacturing employment, essentially contributing to its economic deterioration throughout the second half of the 20th century. Now, why is this important? Is because if you follow the first several years of manufacturing workers in the Rust Belt unionized, they were making high wages. And you're like, look, the unions are doing great. And the unionized workers are doing great. They're making higher wages. Everything's going great. And when they didn't get what they wanted, the unions would lead a strike. There would be major work stoppages and so forth. But over time, what happened? So over time, companies are like, well, there's high costs, high labor costs, significantly higher within the Rust Belt than outside of the Rust Belt, even for unionized workers. So what happened in the Rust Belt? So excessive union demands, strikes, and work stoppages led to lower average rates of investment and productivity growth by Rust Belt firms relative to those of the rest of the country. So over time, companies moved from inside of the Rust Belt to outside of the Rust Belt, and that means employment, so work jobs, moved from the Rust Belt to outside of the Rust Belt. And again, this is kind of like a common sense way to thinking about it, because if Rust Belt firms face increased labor costs and reduced productivity, it incentivizes them to essentially downsize or relocate to regions with less union influence and lower labor costs. And not necessarily very low labor costs, right? But as I pointed out before, the wages that unionized manufacturing workers were making outside of the Rust Belt were like normal average, but the Rust Belt workers unionized were making far higher than anybody else in the rest of the country. So there was something else going on there, and that was like the union influence. And again, if you're thinking about it from a labor union perspective, you're thinking, well, this is great. They're making far higher wages, and this is, a win for workers. But the downside is that the companies can just relocate. They can downsize, especially if you get these like aggressive union kind of relationships with management, because over time it's not a sustainable solution. And that's why one of these, economics papers published in the top journal really hits the nail on the head, because like for a sustainable solution that benefits both the firm and the union over time, you need a balanced kind of moderate effect of like balanced wage increases and so forth. And obviously, what creates some of these conflicts is constant work stoppages and strikes as well, because what does the company say? Well, okay, I'm paying no one's working. We're getting these, by the way, defective products. That's another part of the literature as well. And instead I can relocate to other regions or downsize completely.
Yeah, well, I guess two questions. One, how do you get a union to moderate? I mean, these are supposed to be adversarial collective bargaining relationships, short of, I don't know, turning them into a company union or something like that. How do you get them to moderate?
That's a great question. Part of it is part of it depends on the institutional setting and the environment. So we looked at labor unions in Germany, for example, that were more decentralized, had a lot more flexibility and a greater worker representation. And that seemed to kind of enable the union to act in a better way. I think in the US, we're in a unique setting where we have unions kind of part of this political process in some sense. And by the way, look at surveys of workers, they don't like that aspect of unions. So there was a MIT survey several years ago. There was another, there was a really great, basically, I want to say like one of the top research done on unions by a Harvard professor, and it wrote a book about it called What Workers Want. And in that survey, they specifically said workers didn't want unions to be adversarial with management. And they prefer, and he asked them as a decision, right? You have a trade-off. Do you prefer a union that's powerful and can get you what you want? Or would you prefer a union that is not adversarial with management, but has less decision-making power? And workers preferred the other union. They didn't want an adversarial union to represent them. They wanted, even at the cost of like less kind of decision-making power, so to speak, on maybe getting them, not getting them as much as what they want and so forth, but they much prefer what they call the cooperative union. And this is coming from an economist who found a lot of benefits from unionization over time and in a lot of the research, and yet still kind of points out in this book that the American system in particular has failed to deliver to workers what they want from unions, and that is like greater cooperation and diversity in the workplace. And that's something else I talk about in the paper. And this gets to your question, David, like what can be done in the US context. Something that I've mentioned and many others, I didn't come up with this idea, is maybe removing the exclusive representation clause from the NLRA. And so for listeners who are not familiar with that, what that does is the exclusive representation clause essentially gives a monopoly status to a union. So 51% of workers in that company vote for that particular union. It makes that union have a winner takes all model. So that means even if you didn't vote for that union, right, you still have to be represented by that union has to represent you. And in a lot of cases, you still have to pay dues to that union as well, even though you don't want them to represent you. So it creates a, winner takes all model. Now, and by the way, it also bars any other unions from stepping in or any other negotiations that are outside of that union that won the vote. And that essentially creates a monopoly status for a union. So it's the exclusive representation clause grants these unions monopoly status so that no one else can kind of talk with management about workers or come up with other ideas or try to cooperate with them in any other way. Is just that union. It gives them a lot of power, and that's what they want a lot of times. But it comes at the expense of like worker voice and worker representation, because as we saw in the surveys and from Freeman's work, is that workers actually want the diversity of unions in the workplace. So what I talk about is if you get rid of the exclusive representation clause, you can have a competition of unions within the same company, right? So I have, Union A and Union B competing for me, the worker, to join their union because they're going to be better able to chat with management and get what we want for you, if that makes sense. And so those two different models. And in our research, what we found is, yes, with the second model of like more diversity, more competition of unions, without the monopoly status of unions, you do get less powerful unions. That's for sure. Okay, and that's some might say that's a downside. But what you get instead is greater worker representation and more diversity, and actually better worker voice, and I would say better services too.
Yeah, the people who would be represented by that union would be people who have voluntarily decided to be members. We talked with Nathan McGrath, a lawyer who's litigating a case involving exclusive representation in the public sector on this last month. And part of what we talked about is that not only would the minority who did not vote for the union, exclusive representation means that they're represented whether they like it or not by the union. But over time, people come and leave their jobs, and 40 years after that union election, virtually no one still on staff actually ever voted for that union. and yet they're all forcibly represented by exclusive representation. So in the end, you have a workforce made up entirely of people who, yeah, they could choose to become a member or not, but they don't really have a choice as to whether they're represented in another way by another union or even representing themselves. So I can see why that would weaken the union in some sense. They could not, for instance, turn off the spigot entirely if they don't like what's happening with the company. So they couldn't call a strike that would effectively shut off their operations. But on the other hand, it would be a union that might be more responsive to membership and might be competing with other unions or other individuals on the basis of things like, does the company like me? Are we doing a good job? Are we a good union with good workers? Do we have training that makes them better employees than they would have otherwise been? You know, all that kind of stuff. That's very interesting. I like that.
But that's the thing is, like, unions could provide really beneficial training, right? They could be the source of kind of helping administer benefits, right? If it's better to go through the union rather than their company. Like, we can think about all different ways and models in which unions can actually enhance, you know, workers' lives, right? But, you know, we tend to forget that we tend to think that monopolies are bad, right? And the private sectors are, but there are monopolies that are labor union monopolies that, for the same reasons that we don't like monopolies in the private market and all the bad outcomes that come with that, those labor unions monopolies in this setting too create the same sort of problems. So competition can enhance kind of products, services, and benefits to consumers in the private market. And labor union competition can enhance the lives of workers in this context.
Now, if you could, so what we usually talk about on this podcast is about public sector labor. Is any of this transferable to the public sector where, in a sense, one has more difficulty outsourcing, right? It happens. I know that I've gotten speeding tickets when I've been in Washington, D.C., that are actually from a different state entirely. Somehow they outsourced their citation department to, I think it was North Carolina or something like that. Is any of this transferable? Can we learn anything about what it's like, for instance, to be a teacher and represented by a public sector union?
It's a great question, Dave. I'm not sure I have a good answer for you, but I will point out to some of the studies that we found as we were doing this literature review of public sector, that we were doing this literature review of unions. Some of these studies included like teachers and other public sector unions. So there is one study from an education sector that found that when school districts removed kind of rigid seniority-based pay structure to more flexible compensation system, it helped with outcomes in those districts, like student outcomes and also worker outcomes as well, basically performance-related outcomes. There was another study. Let me pull it up real quick, actually, if we can pause here for a second, so I can give you the exact data on this. Oh, yeah. So there was a paper that contrasted unionized school districts with non-unionized school districts, and they found with unionized school districts, which managed to extract more funding, raising per pupil spending by about 12.3% and increasing teacher pay, those higher inputs didn't result in increased school improvements. So dropout rates are actually higher in those unionized school districts than they were in non-unionized school districts. And often I think that one is part of like a performance discussion. But in general, I would say like the principles are still there. By the way, also, one thing I will mention is I think in the public sector unions as well, you get a lot of those job security kind of conditions in the contracts. Like you don't see it as much in the private sector unions, but you do in the public sector unions. This comes across a lot in European countries as well. I've studied like labor market in Italy. One of the key things that they're looking for is like job security, right? And so the downside of that, and through every single econ paper that's out there, right, there's a trade-off. You can't have both job security and high employment. You can't. And so, and there was one paper with like a title or a subtitle that said like policymakers have to choose one, either job security or high employment. So you can't have both. And I think that's one of the issues that you get. One of the issues that you get in public sector unions is they put in a lot of those, they put in the contracts that's just basically very hard to fire them. And as a result, yeah, we get a lot of these issues on kind of performance in those services, whether it's the police union, right, or the teachers union. You still get kind of issues on performance. And I will say, one more thing on that is if you include that it makes it very hard to fire someone and job security and all that is in there, as is the case in Italy, a bunch of everyone basically there on those contracts, just impossible to get fired. It means that it's really hard and difficult to hire people. And so as a result, you get reduced job market mobility and fewer job opportunities. And that the highest cost that comes to people. Sorry, let me stop there and start again. The cost of that falls mostly on younger and inexperienced workers or people who have maybe disabilities or other problems with work. And so what that means is if I'm a company or and I want to hire someone, I might not want to take a risk on an inexperienced or young worker. Because it makes it impossible to fire them in the future because you get those like job security clauses in those contracts that the union negotiates for. And you saw this in Italy, by the way. 10 years ago, Italy had 45% youth unemployment rate. It was the highest like in the Western world, and it was unbelievable. And because of that, there was some pressure on the Italian government to reduce some of those job security clauses, right, in those contracts. And guess what happened? Economists studied that. A couple of years later, youth unemployment rate falls. Now, it's not going to be as perfect and great in the U.S. where we have great job mobility and lots of work opportunities, but you saw that effect, right? You reduced you made it a little bit easier to fire people, and guess what? It made it easier to hire people, and especially for youth and inexperienced workers. And by the way, as a personal story, David, like my husband, grew up in Italy, in Milan, went to one of the top universities in Milan, and he and his, very educated cohort from Bocconi University all had to, go abroad to find jobs because it was so hard to find jobs within Italy because there's no like if it's impossible to fire people and to hire people, you're not going to get a lot of job opportunities, especially for these young workers.
So bad for your husband, I guess, in the short run, bad for Italy in the long run. Good for us and your husband in the long run. I guess that's how I met him.
Thank you, Italy, for introducing me to my husband, sending me abroad.
I would also expect, let's see, just to stick with the public sector thing for a second. One of the things that your study, I think, points out is that there are short-term and long-term impacts. And that's an important thing. I've seen private sector workers certainly not factor in what might happen to their job years down the line if they go on strike. In the public sector, I could see, although this would be an empirical question, I don't know if the evidence would bear it out, but if a teachers union is too powerful, they secure, among other things, higher benefits and wages for teachers. Over the long run, the taxes in that district are going to be so high that they're going to end up causing people to relocate, move out of that school district and find another. In Pennsylvania, for instance, there are 500 school districts. So you don't have to go that far to find a new school district with a different taxing regime. And if they do that, ultimately the number of students in that school fall, and you don't need as many teachers, or they don't, say the arts program gets cut, or they no longer can field a football team, whatever it might be. But in the long run, those teachers find themselves in a failing school district. And because of another mechanism, which would be some of the seniority protections, it's not worth it for them to move to a different school district. So they're stuck. They're really stuck.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think about it falling on the taxpayers at the end of the day. But yeah, then you have to increase taxes in order to fund all of the asks that they're asking for in these public sector unions, and that goes to like police unions and others as well. I assume anyone else that, and all the different services that the locality will provide.
Now, you talked about in the research and mentioned here today that there are different kinds of unions that might produce different kinds of results. So you mentioned this model that might be exclusive representation, I guess a union without the exclusive representation model. What are some other union, or worker representation formats that might also produce really good results?
So I would say what we looked at union models across the world, and Germany, by the way, has a ton of studies on. For some reason, economists really studied a lot the different German models and actually compared them to the Italian models. So I'll just give one example of the German model. So essentially, and by the way, in the literature and the research, they contrast like the German models versus the Italian models, and then explain why the outcomes in the German models and in Germany, in the German economy, like the bad outcomes are not as much in Germany, but they're far worse in Italy, because Italy has basically a centralized bargaining union, centralized.
Okay, got it. So like a national union that represents everybody everywhere in the country. Okay.
Yeah. Whereas in Germany, they allow for more of like a decentralized model. So there's decentralized wage bargaining where multiple smaller unions kind of operate independently, and they can also raise employment and reduce inflation when labor is sufficiently suitable across different unions too. And so what this does is so it's essentially like a decentralized labor union model. It allows for firms to be more flexible in managing kind of labor costs by giving them the ability to substitute workers from different unions. And so there's that sort of model that exists in Germany that mitigates, and these several studies looked at it. They mitigate the negative effects of unions in Germany, and that's why partly that's part of the reason why Germany in Europe is a little bit more functional than so to say Italy, where you don't get any of that kind of adaptability, flexibility, or decentralized model. There's also some things in the German model where they allow for greater worker representation and so forth. But I will say, coming back to the U.S., what does that mean? What can we take away from that here? Is in any ways that, and there's several policies that have been kind of discussed, not by me, but others, about allowing for more flexibility, anything that allows for more adaptability as well, might go a long way in helping with kind of moderating the negative effects that powerful unions can have.
I'll give you an anecdote from the public sector here. One of the teachers that I represented in a lawsuit against their union, we were having a conversation unrelated to the lawsuit, where he used to be a local union representative who was on the bargaining team. And so they were sitting down with it was a very small school district, sitting down to negotiate terms of the next contract, and they live in that city with the union. With the school district. They understand what the circumstances are. People are moving. This is a Rust Belt town out in western Pennsylvania. And people are moving out, and they realize that the school district is strapped for cash. So they're coming to an agreement relatively quickly that both sides seem to appreciate. And then there's someone called the Uniserv rep, somebody from the state union, who supervises basically bargaining all across the state, probably lives in Philadelphia, across the state, flies in and says, no, we're not doing this. We need a different, we don't give in on healthcare. We need higher wages, whatever they might be. They come in, and in other words, the centralized representative comes in and tries to make things one size fits all across the state, really harming even these very pro-union workers' desire to agree and cooperate with their employer. And in the end, that school district isn't getting any better in terms of their financial health. So that's interesting. If they could go out of business, I guess they would, but.
So David, that's a great example of what this research is highlighting, where if you can allow for these decentralized kind of local groups to come up with their own agreements, that can go a long way in mitigating some of the negative effects that we get from unions.
Great. Well, I've appreciated having you here, Liya. How can we find this study and follow you in the future?
We'll post the study on my Substack, Labor Market Matters, as soon as it's available. And you can search for me on Mercatus website or just Liya Palagashvili, long last name, on Google, and hopefully one of our links will come up there as well. And it was such a great, conversation with you, David, today. I think main takeaway that, our research finds, and that I want listeners to get away with, is that, just because we say labor union, we shouldn't think that that's synonymous with pro-worker outcomes, because there are trade-offs in how labor unions can help or harm workers. And they might be able to help workers in the short run with higher wage increases, but in the long run, if they're very aggressive and kind of have excessive or sort of demand, sort of like we saw with the port strikes and the labor union there, it can lead to worse outcomes for those same workers in the long run.
Well, the draft study you sent to me is very readable for someone like me, not an academic, and it summarizes a grand total of 147 studies, meaning that I don't have to read all of them. I think you've pulled the best out of it. So thank you I think it's a real contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David.